The Machiavellians by James Burnham, Part 7, Politics and Truth. David Byron, who recently published an intellectual biography of James Burnham, considered Part 7 of the Machiavellians as the most important section of Burnham's work. Part 7, titled Politics and Truth, applied the principles of Machiavellian thought to the historical circumstances of the 1940s. But before doing so, Burnham condensed the main tenets of Machiavellian realism into 13 principles. Chapter 1, The Nature of the Present. The 13 Principles of Machiavellianism. Straight away, Burnham lists the 13 principles that he considered the main tenets of Machiavellianism. Number 1, an objective science of politics and society, comparable in its methods to other empirical sciences, is possible. Number 2, the primary subject matter of political science is a struggle for social power in its diverse, open, and concealed forms. Number 3, the laws of political life cannot be discovered by an analysis which takes men's words and beliefs, spoken or written, at their face value. Number 4, logical and rational actions play a relatively minor part in political and social change. Number 5, for an understanding of the social process, the most significant social division to be recognized is that between the ruling class and the ruled, between the elite and the non-elite. Number 6, historical and political science is above all the study of the elite, its composition, its structure, and the mode of its relation to the non-elite. Number 7, the primary object of every elite or ruling class is to maintain its own power and privilege. Number 8, the rule of the elite is based upon force and fraud. The force may, to be sure, be such of the time hidden or only threatened, and the fraud may not entail any conscious deception. Number 9, the social structure as a whole is integrated and sustained by a political formula, which is usually correlated with a generally accepted religion, ideology, or myth. Number 10, the rule of an elite will coincide now more, now less with the interests of the non-elite. Number 11, two opposing tendencies always operate in the case of every elite. The first, an aristocratic tendency whereby the elite seeks to preserve the ruling position of its members and their descendants, and to prevent others from entering its ranks. And second, a democratic tendency whereby new elements force their way into the elite from below. Number 12, in the long run, the second of these tendencies always prevails. And sort of as an aside, it is interesting to note that Burnham believed that the democratic tendency always prevails over the autocratic tendency, which sort of contradicts pretty much everything else he said in the rest of the Machiavellians, that the iron law of oligarchy always prevails over any political circumstance. Anyways, the 13th and final principle of Machiavellian thought is that there occur periodically very rapid shifts in the composition and structure of elites, that is, social revolutions. Burnham spent the rest of Chapter 1 elaborating upon this last point regarding social revolutions and composition of the elites. From a Machiavellian point of view, explained Burnham, quote, a social revolution means a comparatively rapid shift in the composition and structure of the elite and in the mode of its relation to the non-elite. Burnham listed 5 conditions for social revolution. Number 1, the ruling elite and the institutional structure become unable to handle social forces and technological advances. Number 2, a significant portion of the ruling class diverts its attention away from the business of government and turns instead to art, philosophy, and satisfying carnal pleasures. Number 3, the ruling class becomes stagnant and unwilling or unable to circulate members from the lower classes into the elite. Number 4, a considerable section of the ruling elite lose faith in the legitimacy of their government. Consequently, the non-elite abandon political myths and formulas that hold society together. Number 5, the ruling class becomes impotent in its ability or desire to use force and instead comes to rely upon deceit, manipulation, and fraud. In Machiavelli's terms, the ruling elite loses the qualities of the lion and assumes the qualities of the fox. Indeed, Burnham believed the America of his time was undergoing a massive social revolution, which was the subject of his earlier book, The Managerial Revolution, published in 1941. In it, Burnham argued that neither capitalism nor socialism would determine the world order. Rather, he argued that the 20th century would be characterized by what he called the Managerial Revolution. Burnham observed that this managerial revolution rested on 5 preconditions, each of which satisfied his aforementioned prerequisites for revolution. First, technology advanced beyond the control of the ruling elite. Indeed, corporations and supply chains became so complex that owners delegated control to managers, who effectively controlled the means of production. This observation was fundamental to Burnham's theory of the managerial revolution. Second, and related to the first, since the capitalist ruling class delegated control of the means of production to the managers, they consequently retreated from active economic and political life. Therefore, the ruling class of capitalists reduced their influence upon society. Third, the ruling class became increasingly unable or unwilling to assimilate new members from the lower classes. Thus, the hierarchy became ossified and impervious to innovation. Fourth, the capitalist ruling class lost faith in laissez-faire myths that upheld their rule. Indeed, at the time of Burnham's writings, the Great Depression had already endured for more than a decade. For many, this clearly indicated that capitalism and laissez-faire economics had failed. Fifth, and related to the fourth, the capitalist ruling class lost the will to rule. According to Burnham, humanitarian and utopian ideas undermined the ruling class's faith in its position as legitimate rulers. It is worth noting that the increased expression of humanitarian sentiment in almost all areas of social life corresponded to an increase of suffrage and democratic sentiment in society. This increased democracy in the formal sense, but paradoxically, Burnham argued that expanding suffrage did not necessarily increase democracy in the real sense. As Burnham explained early in the book, the literal meaning and real meaning of democracy are categorically distinct. The true meaning of democracy is the subject of Burnham's next chapter. Chapter 2, the meaning of democracy. In terms of Burnham's real and formal meaning, the formal meaning or face value of democracy does not equate to its real meaning or instrumental value. In Burnham's conception, formal meaning relates to the literal meaning of words, or taking political speech at face value. Real meaning, on the other hand, equates to the instrumental value of political speech, or how said speech affects and influences society. In other words, the formal theoretical idea of democracy does not correspond to its real, practical value. Theoretically, the formal meaning of democracy means government by the people, of the people, for the people, if we are to accept Lincoln's definition. In practice, however, reiterating the Machiavellian position that every society is governed by a ruling class, Burnham asserted that democracy is impossible, as he professed, quote, "The democratic theory does not correctly describe any social facts. No societies are governed by the people, by a majority. All societies, including societies called democratic, are ruled by a minority," end quote. However, though democracy is a myth, it is a myth of immense social value. For Burnham, the real meaning or instrumental value of democracy is threefold. First, the popular idea of democracy instills a common faith among the people that they have a say in their government. The notion that the people live under some sort of representative government quells and appeases the masses. The system remains ruled by a ruling class, a minority, but the people are not perturbed by this because they believe, nonetheless, that they are participants in a system of self-government, of the people, by the people, for the people. Burnham even likened democracy to a kind of political safety valve that allowed the people to let off some steam. However, as we shall see, though Burnham observed that no nation ever realized perfect democracy, he also found democratic tendencies exist to some extent in most societies. This is the second aspect of the instrumental value of democracy. Democratic tendencies pose bottom-up challenges to the top-down autocratic tendencies of the ruling class, therefore creating an internal balance of power. For Burnham, such tendencies play a critical role in checking the autocratic power and maintaining stability within society. For Burnham, such tendencies play a critical role in checking autocratic power and maintaining stability within society. But democracy also has the potential to concentrate power into the hands of the state. This is the third component of the real meaning of democracy. The democratic mythos of the 19th and 20th centuries, by gathering popular support for government, had the effect of the people granting unprecedented powers to the state. Under democracy, the people believe that the government represents their interests. Thus, they take less issue with allocating more and more power to the state. According to Burnham, the dictatorial regimes of Napoleon Bonaparte and Napoleon III constituted the, quote, culmination of the democratic formula, end quote. Elaborating upon this point, Burnham translated formal meanings of democracy into real meanings. Quote, "The people century, the century of the common man, become like the people's state and the classless society, variant expressions, the real meaning of which is the century of political Bonapartism, or the Bonapartist state, end quote. For Burnham, political Bonapartism represented the historical origins of totalitarian government. For examples of political Bonapartism in his own time, Burnham pointed to President Franklin D. Roosevelt and Vice President Harry A. Wallace. With regard to Wallace, Burnham criticized a speech delivered at Madison Square Garden on November 8, 1942, celebrating the 25th anniversary of the Russian Revolution. Wallace began his speech revealing the opportunity to commemorate a quarter century of totalitarianism in the USSR. Quote, "We have been helping the Russians celebrate this afternoon a glorious birthday," end quote. Burnham also chastised the coverage of the celebration in the press. The press overlooked the detail that the revolution in question was not the revolution against Tsarism, which took place in March 1917, but the November Bolshevik Revolution against the parliamentary democratic government of Kerensky, the revolution which in its development was led to the most extreme totalitarian Bonapartist government in history, end quote. Wallace praised the Soviet Union for including in its policies, quote, "not only the Bill of Rights, but also economic democracy, ethnic democracy, educational democracy, and democracy in the treatment of the sexes," end quote, all of which, quote, "must be woven together into a harmonious whole," end quote. Wallace praised the Soviet system as superior to that of the United States in all of the above categories, except the Bill of Rights. But for Wallace, this was a feature, not a defect. As Wallace proclaimed, quote, "We have overemphasized what might be called political or Bill of Rights democracy. Carried to its extreme form, it leads to rugged individualism, exploitation, impractical emphasis on states' rights, and even to anarchy." From Burnham's perspective, this speech by Wallace represented an open glorification and admiration of totalitarianism, couched in democratic language. Such rhetoric championing collectivism over individualism expressed a harrowing example of the language employed by the democratic totalitarians, as Burnham called them. If Vice President Harry Wallace's praise of totalitarianism wasn't startling enough, President Roosevelt's warning to Congress 2 months prior might be. On September 7, 1942, FDR demanded that Congress remove certain provisions of the Emergency Price Control Act. Specifically, FDR took aim at sections of the act that forbade price ceilings on certain commodities, especially agricultural goods. Roosevelt maintained that price controls on food were necessary to curb inflation and reduce the cost of living. As Roosevelt admonished, quote, "I ask the Congress to take this action by the 1st of October. Inaction on your part by that date will leave me with an inescapable responsibility to the people of the country to see to it that the war effort is no longer imperiled by a threat of economic chaos. In the event that the Congress should fail to act and act adequately, I shall accept the responsibility, and I will act. At the same time that farm prices are stabilized, wages can and will be stabilized also. This I will do. When the war is won, the powers under which I act automatically revert to the people, to whom they belong." This final sentence struck Burnham's interest as it implied that the powers of the people rest in the hands of the president, the only federal official in the executive branch elected by popular vote. Burnham took this remark to mean that Roosevelt believed that he alone embodied the democratic voice of the whole nation, and therefore felt justified in sidestepping Congress. As FDR made clear, if Congress failed to act, he would use his executive powers to stabilize the cost of food, wages, and rents. When Congress did not act according to FDR's wishes, FDR signed Executive Order 9250, establishing the Office for Economic Stabilization and placing price controls on rents, wages, and agricultural goods. For Burnham, this represented a critical departure in American political history. Quote, "It is particularly enlightening to understand that the executive, as the directly responsible agent of the people, is now able to supersede Congress, and that the powers under which the executive is now acting are derived not from congressional legislation, but, again, directly from the people," end quote. This development, Burnham averred, represented the formation of Bonapartism in American politics. Roosevelt interpreted his popular election as a license to assume unprecedented executive authority. FDR's belief that he could use his popularity to justify shirking congressional procedure closely resembled the democratic despotism of both Napoleons. Even worse, Burnham observed that this Bonapartist despotism received legitimacy through popular mandate with FDR's 4 electoral victories. According to Burnham, the people's endorsement of FDR represented, quote, a paradoxical political phenomenon, the rapidly growing number of individuals in this country who may be properly called democratic totalitarians, end quote. To be fair, FDR's administration was not totalitarian. Fortunately, though state control certainly expanded under Roosevelt, it did not pervade every aspect of daily life as witnessed in Hitler's Germany or Stalin's Russia. Nevertheless, Burnham offered much to contend with when he paraphrased Huey Long, quote, if fascism destroys democracy in this country, it will do so in the name of democracy, end quote. If Roosevelt was willing to expand the state in the name of democracy, Burnham worried that the same justification might be used to curtail civil liberties. Primarily, Burnham's concerns involved abridgments of free speech, following Mosca's contention that this liberty stood first above all others. Moreover, Burnham observed that free speech performs more than just a political function. Burnham maintained free speech is fundamental to scientific inquiry. As he said, quote, science can proceed only where there is complete freedom to advance hypotheses contrary to the prevailing opinion, end quote. Burnham then quoted an equally resolute defense of free speech from Pareto, quote, it follows that before a theory can be considered true, it is virtually indispensable that there be perfect freedom to impugn it. Any limitation, even indirect and however remote, imposed on anyone choosing to contradict it, is enough to cast suspicion upon it. Hence, freedom to express one's thought, even counter to the opinion of the majority or of all, even when it offends the sentiments of the few or of the many, even when it is generally reputed absurd or criminal, always proves favorable to the discovery of objective truth, end quote. Akin to the notion that science requires the freedom to express dissent, Burnham contended that, quote, the existence of public opposition or oppositions is the only effective check on the power of the governing elite, end quote. Therefore, Burnham concluded that the right of public opposition to the ruling class represented the heart of freedom. Borrowing from Pareto's circulation of elites, Burnham believed a stable society required that members of the non-ruling class have a chance to challenge and even replace the ruling class. However, he warned that this cannot be maintained without certain preconditions. As Burnham elaborated, quote, the right of public opposition requires the existence in society of a number of relatively autonomous social forces, as Mosca calls them. It demands that no single social force, the army or liquid wealth, or the church, or industrial management, or agriculture, or labor, or the state machine, whatever it might be, shall be strong enough to swallow up the rest and thereby be in a position to dominate all phases of social life, end quote. Indeed, a state in which one social force controls all areas of society is the definition of totalitarianism. This observation bears striking similarity to Hannah Arendt's concept of intermediary institutions that she described in The Origins of Totalitarianism. In totalitarian states, as evidenced in the Soviet and Nazi regimes, the state wielded complete control over daily life. In Arendt's terms, totalitarian states assumed control over the intermediary institutions, like social clubs, labor unions, youth groups, religious organizations, etc., that historically served as a buffer between the individual and the state. In Burnham's terms, borrowed from Mosca, totalitarian states took control of the social forces so that no social force acted autonomously or posed a threat to the state. Under totalitarianism, all social forces become subsumed under the all-encompassing, hence total control of the state. As Mussolini put it bluntly, quote, everything for the state, nothing outside the state, nothing above the state, end quote. Under the totalitarian regimes of Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia, hardly anyone registered their dissent against the government because one party controlled virtually all social forces and intermediary institutions. To maintain this total control, totalitarian regimes could not tolerate opposition. Individuals who dared protest could expect harsh reprisals from the state, up to and including death. Without the ability to register dissent against the ruling class, Burnham insisted liberty cannot exist. Following Mosca, Burnham believed that, quote, there is no one force, no group, and no class that is the preserver of liberty, end quote. Only the existence of free expression and public dissent among a multitude of opposing groups can guarantee political freedom. This position, derived from Machiavelli's concept of mixed government, led Burnham to an interesting conclusion. Quote, liberty is preserved by those who are against the existing chief power. In other words, those who oppose the ruling class are the defenders of freedom, not by virtue of their arguments, virtues, or values, but by providing a necessary check on power. This, for Burnham, is the most important aspect of the real meaning of democracy. Nominally, in terms of formal meaning, democracies claim to represent the will of the people. In reality, or in terms of real meaning, democracies do no such thing, and never could. Recalling Michel's contention that all societies tend toward oligarchy, Burnham believed that democracies cannot be democratic in any real sense. In reality, all that matters is the existence of an opposition to the ruling class, a formidable democratic tendency with which the ruling class must contend. Simply calling this arrangement democracy does not alter the iron law of oligarchy. Democratic practices that may exist in a society are completely ancillary, mere features of an oligarchic system. But democratic tendencies, as somewhat distinct from democratic practices, may exist nevertheless. Following Michel's, Burnham believed stable societies exhibit a balance of democratic and autocratic tendencies. Burnham painted a rather bleak picture of democracy. Nevertheless, most Americans today would probably agree that America functions more like an oligarchy than a democracy. In the next and final chapter, Burnham offered a set of prescriptions to address this state of affairs. Chapter 3, Can Politics Be Scientific? For centuries, at least since Machiavelli, philosophers pondered whether politics can be scientific. This question received an affirmative answer from one of America's leading philosophers. As Burnham related, quote, John Dewey, the leading American philosopher, and his followers continue to debate this problem, to give an affirmative answer, and to maintain an attitude of social optimism, end quote. Though not one of his followers, Burnham credited Dewey with demonstrating that the question of whether politics can be scientific is much akin to the question of whether democracy is possible. In the 19th century, leaders like Horace Mann asserted that universal education provided the answers to these critical questions. Mann believed that only compulsory education could train the masses to think scientifically and thereby produce a population capable of democracy. In many ways, Dewey represented the culmination of this project. Dewey was not just the premier American philosopher of his time, he was, and probably still is, America's most influential thinker with regard to education and pedagogy. Due to the influence of Mann and Dewey's ideas, according to Burnham, quote, it was thought by many that universal education would enable the masses to be scientific about politics and thereby reach a perfect democracy. This expectation has proven unfounded, end quote. Today, many will surely share Burnham's disappointment with the results of American education. Moreover, for Burnham, the failure of education in America to create a scientific politics confirmed that democracy is not possible. Since the time of Burnham's writings, opportunities for education in America expanded, yet our democracy seems more fragile than ever. Burnham would not be surprised with these unfortunate circumstances. The spread of education and corresponding increase of literacy rates did not result in the spread of democracy in any real sense. Quite the contrary, Burnham argued that greater literacy among the population only predisposed the people to be more easily manipulated by print media and propaganda. As he declared, quote, in political affairs, the scientific potentialities of wider literacy have been more than counterbalanced by the new opportunities which mass education gives to non-scientific propaganda, end quote. Contrary to Dewey, Burnham believed democracy to be impossible. Therefore, politics cannot be scientific under democratic government. As he explained, quote, the inability of the masses to function scientifically in politics rests primarily on the following factors. 1. The huge size of the mass group, which makes it too unwieldy for the use of scientific techniques. 2. The ignorance on the part of the masses of the methods of administration and rule. 3. The necessity for the masses of spending most of their energies on the bare making of a living, which leaves little energy or time for gaining more knowledge about politics or carrying out practical political tasks. 4. The lack in most people of a sufficient degree of those psychological qualities, ambition, ruthlessness, and so on, that are prerequisites for active political life, end quote. In Burnham's judgment, an honest politician would instruct the masses with the following statement, quote, you cannot rule yourselves. Distrust all leaders, and above all those who tell you that they are merely expressing or representing your will. Erect and cherish every possible safeguard against the unchecked exercise of power." End quote. But of course, such a statement would be political suicide in a democratic republic. Therefore, Burnham believed politicians had no choice but to lie. The myth of democracy requires that the people maintain a delusional belief in democracy. Without this underlying faith, the political system would crumble. Therefore, politicians have no choice but to lie, to perpetuate the myth of democracy. Again, going back to Burnham's distaste for Bonapartism, the danger of democracy lies in the possibility of a democratically elected dictatorship. People forget that Hitler, like Napoleon, was democratically elected. Claiming the mandate of the people, these popular dictators justified their actions by claiming they represented the will of the people. Thus, as Burnham declared, quote, "The rulers are no longer personally accountable for their actions. They may go to war, persecute, steal, violate freedoms, fail to prepare for social or military crises, and yet never be brought to task for whatever crime or failure. They have only, they say, carried out the people's will." End quote. Burnham's point about the lack of accountability in democracy may be the most essential insight of this chapter. Under democracy, politicians are fundamentally unaccountable for their actions because they can always claim that their conduct was not derived from their own personal will, but from the will of the people. If a policy ends in disaster, a politician can simply claim that they were acting on behalf of the people. As Burnham warned, quote, "When it is accepted that the rulers rule as the mere agents of the will of the masses, then their rule becomes irresponsible." End quote. For millennia, philosophers acknowledged that, under democracy, power is won by mass persuasion. More than 2,000 years ago, Plato argued that democracy is ruled by appealing to the basest passions of the people. Appeals to passions and emotions are not based in logic or reason. Therefore, democracy cannot be ruled by reason and truth. Going back to Sorel, people are less often persuaded by truth than by myths. Therefore, the most successful politicians are those who make the most favorable appeals to popular myths. And in our time, that most popular myth is the myth of democracy. The power and stability of the democratic state depends on the support of the people. The greater the approval of the people, the greater the cohesion and power of the state. Therefore, the primary occupation of politicians in democratic societies is not necessarily competent governments, but winning votes. Again, these votes are won most often not by appeals to truth, but by appeals to myth. To be effectively employed, these myths require not validity, but cultural currency. The various religions are potent examples, but myths need not be of a spiritual nature to persuade the public, especially in a secular society. Any widely held ideology can be used for this purpose, from liberalism to conservatism, to collectivism to individualism, etc. As Burnham explained, quote, "The political life of the masses and the cohesion of society demand the acceptance of myths. A scientific attitude toward society does not permit belief in the truth of the myths, but the leaders must profess, indeed foster, belief in the myths, or the fabric of society will crack and they will be overthrown. In short, the leaders, if they themselves are scientific, must lie." End quote. Burnham would have forgiven politicians for their dishonesty if they competently applied the scientific approach to government. One of the conditions of scientific governance is the ability to profess faith in the democratic myth without actually believing it. However, Burnham observed, quote, "The tendency is for the deceivers to become self-deceived, to believe their own myths. When this happens, they are no longer scientific. Sincerity is bought at the price of truth." Even more disappointing for Burnham, the rulers are increasingly scientific in their methods of propaganda, yet they remain anti-scientific in their administration of governance. As Burnham lamented, quote, "Our leaders are for the most part non-scientific and even anti-scientific in their handling of major social issues, while at the same time they have adopted scientific techniques in dealing with narrower problems of mass manipulation." End quote. Again, if politicians take a scientific approach to power and persuasion, they must marshal arguments based on myths they themselves do not believe. But to remain scientific, leaders cannot believe their own myths. Put briefly, under democracy, leaders must lie, but they cannot deceive themselves. This is not unique to democracy. The doctrine of divine right of kings, for example, is equally fallacious. But Burnham suggested that the propagation of myths and lies are more pronounced in democracies because politicians must appeal to the passions and sentiments of the people to win their vote. Appeals to passions must necessarily employ emotive arguments, not rational ones. Therefore, for Burnham, it is unlikely that politics can be scientific in democratic societies. But can politics nevertheless be scientific? Burnham indicated that it is unlikely that leaders can govern scientifically under democracy, but he remained hopeful that a new generation of leaders may someday inaugurate an age of scientific government. With that, Burnham ended his book on a hopeful note, punctuated by cautionary tone. Quote, "It is probable that civilized society will somehow survive. It will not survive, however, if the course of the ruling class continues in the direction of the present and of the past 40 years. But during the monstrous wars and revolutions of our time, there has already begun on a vast scale a purge of the ranks of the ruling class. That purge and the recruitment of new leaders which accompanies it may be expected to continue until they bring about a change in the present course. Though the change will never lead to the perfect society of our dreams, we may hope that it will permit human beings at least that minimum of moral dignity which alone can justify the strange accident of man's existence." End quote. By the purge of the ruling class, Burnham meant the replacement of the old capitalist elite. Without this circulation of the elites, Burnham cautioned that society will not survive. By new leaders, Burnham almost certainly referred to the managerial revolution that he postulated in his earlier book by the same name. Burnham argued that though politics under democracy cannot be scientific, he remained optimistic that the managerial revolution would realize a system of scientific government. Can politics be scientific? Burnham answered in the affirmative, given that a new scientific ruling class would remove the democratic, capitalist, and unscientific regime. Curiously, however, Burnham did not ask whether politics should be scientific. Burnham's final paragraph suggests that America should be run by some kind of scientific technocracy. If we accept that Burnham's theory of the managerial revolution successfully predicted the changing composition of the ruling class in the mid-20th century, it is not clear that the managerial elite are any more accountable than the previous ruling class. Indeed, it could be said that the managerial revolution prophesied the formation of what is colloquially referred to as the deep state, a class of unelected and unaccountable public and private agents who are the real locus of power in society. And this is quite similar to Edward Bernays' observation that the people who actually rule society are faceless, nameless individuals that nobody really knows, but nevertheless control the means of production and the means of power in society. Whatever dangers lay in Burnham's prescriptions, Burnham deftly applied a realistic analysis of the nature and arrangement of power in the United States during the early 1940s. Moreover, Burnham's work stood the test of time. The Machiavellians provided deep insights into the history of politics and power. In addition to delineating the Machiavellian principles of power and politics listed at the beginning of Part 7, Chapter 1, Burnham's emphasis on the character and composition of the ruling class merits deep consideration. Of course, he was not right about everything, but it is difficult to argue with his contention that the history of every society is determined by the ruling class. The disposition and attributes of the membership of the ruling class condition the trajectory of society. In Machiavelli's terms, if the ruling class assumes the qualities of the lion, society will be based on force. If the qualities of the fox, society will be based on fraud. Whatever the case may be, Burnham concluded, quote, "The fate of an entire society is frequently, whether one likes it or not, and unjust as it may seem usually to be, bound up with the fate of its ruling class." End quote. This concludes my summary of Part 7 of the Machiavellians by James Burnham. Please stay tuned for a forthcoming summary of the managerial revolution, elucidating Burnham's prognosis of the 20th century and the replacement of the capitalist class with what he called the managerial class. For direct citations for each of these quotes, please see my Substack at benyaturi.substack.com. Thank you.